So just summing up our discussion boards, I'll try and do this every week where I just recap a lot of the questions and some of the stuff that we talked about for the week and go over the questions again, maybe talk a little bit about a consensus or trouble some of the ideas as we're moving them on. And so I'm looking at the questions from March 30th and I'm going to try and talk through some of those. So we had, we had 7 questions. And so just really quickly, the first one was asking about the stranger and what he might represent in the novel. A lot of really good discussion about this. I remember Coleman talking about it as being a part of his psyche or sort of a disassociated personality. A lot of people thinking about him being like the devil on his shoulder, if nothing else. I think all these are good early guesses. Obviously, as you get farther along in the novel, the role of that character is going to be a lot clearer. But right now, I do think that there's a little bit of purposeful misdirection by O'Connor. She's making us wonder if this is a real thing or if this is some sort of disassociation. Is this a part of a mental illness? Or is this really the break between the physical and religious world? And here is a person that's experiencing a demon possession. And we kind of primed the pump for this. And I think one of you mentioned this about visitation of spirits, where it's sort of like, well, we kind of have seen this already. Second question was asking about the family dynamic in the novel. I thought it was funny that was it Meredith and Avery were talking about how they're always at each other. It's not a healthy dynamic, right? And in some ways, that's a bit of the horror element for me too, and especially in these times of social isolation, is, we've stumbled into this novel where these people are holding grudges and we don't understand what those grudges are and we don't have the history for them. And so all of that history has to be told to us. And that's exactly the situation that Tarwater finds himself in, is he's, I'm not a part of this. I never really understood what was going on. So he's given this information and then forms these opinions about, his uncle or whatever, based on just the information that he's been provided. So in some ways, that's very much like what we're doing in the novel. We're coming in, we don't understand what's happening, we don't understand the history, and we're sort of being forced to take sides. So that family dynamic is definitely one of the more horrific parts of the novel. We had 2 questions that I think are kind of related. One was, how does the narration style switching affect your reading of it? And then the other one was, how does the discrepancy in knowledge between reader and character affect the way we receive information? Some really good discussion here, especially by Mary Franke. Ben was talking a lot about this. And then also Caitlin with some great conversation about this. And I think they're connected because remember, when we have that third person limited, we're sort of limited to that perspective, and yet we're not inside of their head. And so we tend to not be able to identify with them as much as if it were in first person. If you can imagine what a first person narration might be like for Tarwater, for the uncle, or for Rayburn, or for whatever, if we could get inside these people's heads, what's going on inside of there. And someone mentioned, I can't remember exactly who it was, maybe it was Ben, this notion of we don't really understand how young and naive Tarwater is until we see that limited third person perspective and we realize that difference between what he's experiencing and what he's believing and what his truth is and what the objective truth is on the outside. And once we see that discrepancy, we're like, oh, right, this is sort of a Bildungsroman too. And so there's an unreliable narrator aspect. And I tried to trouble a little bit of the water by saying, is O'Connor just an unreliable author? And I think there's certainly things that we can talk about with that. But that was a good discussion about 2 questions that I think were linked. We had this really cool question about, like, do you think of Edgar Allan Poe as a Southern Gothic writer? And then we proceeded, Cameron was in on this, I've got some of this, Diana, Donamy, Cecilia, where we had to look at both of those integers. Well, what do you mean when we say Gothic author? What do we mean when we say Southern author? And weirdly, Poe is in one of these areas contested in terms of region. I think I mentioned this in my comments, where by and large, the notion of Southern writing or Southern authorship really does become associated with a very early 20th century Southern Renaissance kind of tradition. And that doesn't really go back and recuperate a lot of Southern authors. And then the Gothic tradition, that's a really interesting question as well, because are you talking about the Goth tradition or the revival of the Gothic tradition or the associated 19th century Gothic tradition? Like, how do we parse this out? And I certainly think if you asked, is Poe a Gothic writer, the uniform answer would be yes. But if you asked to pose a Southern writer, then that gets a little tricky. So that I really like that question. It was sort of a fanboy question. Another fanboy question was, do you have any favorite Southern Gothic works? And Ben was talking about Otranto. Coleman was talking about Otranto. Zach mentioned Bastard out of Carolina, which has some of these Gothic elements. And then, of course, we went into the classic rock of Southern Gothic and A Rose for Emily and Faulkner and all of those kind of things. Don't forget that while we're doing this, that we're watching Night of the Hunter, which is one of those quintessential Southern Gothic aesthetics. And that is very much a part of the Southern Gothic tradition as well. So it's not just these literary texts, it's cultural texts, it's filmic texts. That's one of my favorite Southern Gothic texts, for example. So, and I think you could even, broaden this out. You're talking about Carson McCullers, you're talking about Eudora Welty, you're talking about all of these exaggerated, grotesque kind of things. The South certainly has its share of those. So a lot of stuff to dig around in there. And then finally, what ways has the novel exemplified Southern Gothicism or the Southern Gothic? And that was a really good discussion. I think Coleman started us off, and Mary Frankie and Meredith and Cameron talking about here, what is Southern Gothic, and then why is the South so uniquely situated to be a part of this Gothic agenda? Because we have this romanticization of the past that we bring into the present, and that grotesque disruption between something we should have progressed beyond that we're still holding on to. So the decaying mansion, the plantation aristocracy, all of these things that make Gothicism such a good graft onto Southern identity. And I think we ended that by talking a little bit about my hobby horse, which is that Gothicism and modernism are such easy bedmate. They go so well together. And of course, Southern modernism was the explosion or the impetus for that Southern Renaissance, that flowering of Southern discourse and Southern literature that happened in the early 20th century. So consequently, some of our most famous and most prolific modernist writers all came from the South. So it's not a coincidence then that Southern modernism and Southern Gothicism are kind of sharing that moment together. Okay, so those are the questions. I'll stop now. We got some really great questions that are already up on the board for you guys to tackle. Great job so far. I mean, it's very difficult to replicate that amazing dynamic that we had in class, but you guys are certainly giving it your all, and I'm going to do it too. I'll try and post one of these each week where we sort of sum up the things that we talked about for the first week. So please keep it up, and I'll see you in a bit. Bye.